Okay, good evening, afternoon, morning, wherever you are. My name is Roxanne Douglas. I work at the University of Warwick in the English and Comparative Literary Studies department, and I'm so excited to be talking to you today. I hope you're all here because you're curious about how exactly the Jurassic Park franchise is Gothic. But I'm going to be taking a bit of a decolonial feminist perspective on the franchise today too. And I'd love any questions or ideas that you have about this as we go along. So do keep chatting away in the chat box too. So this actually isn't my direct specialism. I am branching into decolonial kind of feminist Gothic studies. But I am an expert on feminist Arabic Gothic traditions, which I'll be giving a talk on here in November. So if you enjoy this one, sign up to that one too, as well as the book club on Layla Alamar's Silence is a Sense, which I really, really recommend. Just before we kick off properly, I will be mentioning transphobia in the talk, but I won't be diving into it. But if that's a topic that's not for you today, that's totally fine. So just keep an eye out for that. Anyways, so let's get started. So the way that this talk came about is I like to play this game called Everything is Gothic, Change My Mind, which you now can take into your lives too. It's pretty much what it says on the tin. You just get people to give you like a TV show, film, any topic really, and you have to kind of explain how it's Gothic. And one time I was playing and Jurassic Park came up, and lo and behold, I was kind of thinking about it. And I came to realize that, yeah, it actually really is, which is what brings us here today. As a fun aside, this is actually an elongated version of the spiel that I gave my now partner when I first met him, when I was really desperately trying to impress him. And so you should take notes because you never know where this information may take you too. Okay, so let's begin. So according to Elizabeth Parker, Emily Dickinson once declared that nature is a haunted house. Parker goes on to say that certainly nature is every bit as pregnant with Gothic possibilities as any human-made construction. As you probably know, the basic plotline of the first Jurassic film and the novel upon which it's based is that scientists managed to clone dinosaurs, foolishly thinking that they're able to control the dinosaur population by making them all female. However, despite the fact that there is no unauthorized breeding in the park, life, nevertheless, finds a way. I think what makes Parker's assertion that nature itself is as pregnant as any human-made construction is interesting in the context of discussing Jurassic Park. The dinosaurs, the park, and the science fiction behind it, when read through a Gothic lens, sits at the troubling nexus between nature and human construction. In fact, at the most fundamental level, I would argue that the original film does indeed offer us a haunted house. Fred Botting explains that in the Gothic, haunted houses predominate as a somber site on which the past returns to disturb the present. Many of the most iconic images that we might remember from the original Jurassic Park film exemplify this sense of disturbance of one time upon another. They're particular in the way that the pre-human past interacts with the technologies and tools of civilized, mostly Western society. These iconic images are what we might remember best, maybe examples such as the quaking water, signaling that the T-Rex is very much on her way. Here we see plastic cups, which, at least to our 2021 rereading of this film, perhaps signals the fossil fuels and unrefined oils, which actually are the remains of the real versions of the dinosaurs that we now see. Here, these fossil oils are processed by humans to make plastic, and the cups themselves perhaps offer to us the spectre of climate crisis as the film itself becomes a vestige of nostalgia. But nevertheless, they are an object that doubles the threat to come. Likewise, water itself is also a natural resource, which today faces privatization and shortages, especially in the global south, due to excessive monocrop agriculture and production. Other examples more literally see figures of the pre-human past alongside images of science, technology, and advancement. This image of the T-Rex in the Jeep side view has become so strongly embedded in Western cultural consciousness that it was, I would argue quite lovingly, recreated in Toy Story 2. Nevertheless, images of the dinosaurs with vehicles live on past the films. In this example, building on the effect that the T-Rex had on the water cups, the dinosaur whose predecessors literally fuel, and I suppose are also the plastic parts of, the Jeep has overturned it. The imagery here is pretty clear, that nature is not so easily mastered as we might think. Even that which we assume, like the ghost of Gothic fiction, is long gone. Another iconic image from the first film is that the T-Rex inside the hotel cum museum on the island at the film's conclusion. It's of course jarring that we can see the wild coming inside, encroaching on physical and psychological barriers, but the falling banner reads, "When dinosaurs ruled the earth," demonstrating a clear message that dinosaurs have claimed the space as their own, and humanity is no longer at the top of the food chain. However, I want to ask the question, if these films are Gothic, what are we really afraid of here? I would argue it's probably not actually dinosaurs coming back to life, and maybe even questions of human intelligence outrunning itself feel a little outdated to a franchise that to this day still garners a lot of fan attention. So if nature itself is a haunted house, then what happens when nature comes to haunt us? So at this point, I'm just going to share with you briefly a clip from one of the more recent films. So please bear with me while I do a shift. Okay. There we go. Great. Okay, so the clip I just showed you was from the most recent installment of the franchise Jurassic Park Fallen Kingdom, where the island that the park is on has been destroyed and wealthy investors have transported a number of dinosaurs for their own military ends, meaning that the far away, long gone threat of dinosaurs that creeps right into the bedroom of a little girl, remaking images that we might be more familiar with from more typical renderings of the Gothic. This is a still from Guillermo del Toro's Crimson Peak. A far cry from a family film, the wonder and kind of sweeping scores that some of us even use in our weddings, in fact. So how do we get here? Why has this franchise progressed down this road, or rather maybe even into the deep, dark Gothic woods? I'd like to offer you today a thematic rereading of the Jurassic Park franchise that considers how we might use these films to Gothic our thinking about gender, colonialism, and climate change. I'm interested in what is in these films themselves. However, what I really want to do is explore how the Gothic can help us as viewers revisit this franchise and contend with our contemporary fears. This particular image is a promotional image from the Jurassic World, so it isn't a still like the previous images that I showed you. However, I think it's important that we can identify in this image, as with the others, a spectre of the past encroaching not just on the present, but the use of this kind of spherical vehicle. What these films consider is what the future might hold for humanity. The background here, unlike the images from the original Jurassic Park film, has a backdrop not of a leafy, luscious jungle, but of what appears to be an apocalyptic disaster. So let's unpack what we are reconsidering this franchise as Gothic tells us. So as you may or may not know, the film franchise that we have all come to know and love was originally a book published in 1990 by Michael Crichton. The novel follows more or less the same plot as the first Jurassic Park film, where paleontologist Alan Grant and paleobotanist Ellie Sattler, played by Sam Neill and Laura Dern respectively, come to John Hammond's islands populated by dinosaurs, alongside chaos theorist Ian Malcolm, as we remember very memorably played by Jeff Goldblum, and Hammond's grandchildren, of course. There are some differences, however, which make the novel a little bit darker, such as Ian Malcolm is fatally wounded and takes quite a while to die, kind of spewing these prophetic sort of lines about the state of the universe and death and things like that. Anyway, at the end of the novel, the island is actually napalmed and survivors are being held by various militaries, I suppose. And there's sort of an impression that there are dinosaurs on the surrounding islands and they have therefore escaped. So after all that, I'm sure that you are like me thinking that this is quite obviously a re-rendering of Frankenstein, which is something I'm sure Sam can tell us a lot more about in the Q&A session. So according to James J. Meraki, Crichton's novel offers a version of the Frankenstein tale of humanity overreaching itself. Fred Button's book, simply titled Gothic, explains how science, with its chemical concoctions, mechanical laboratories, and electrical instruments, become a new domain for the encounter with dark powers, now secular, mental and animal, rather than supernatural. Crichton's Jurassic Park follows this sensibility into the 1990s. According to Miraki, Crichton's indicting purposes are clear from the start, as he begins the novel with a pseudo-journalistic introduction that describes the headlong and furious haste to commercialize genetic engineering, and asserts that much of the research is thoughtless and frivolous, and that this work is uncontrolled, done in secret, in haste, and for profit. These sensibilities are somewhat toned down in the film adaptation, but the allusions to the foibles of capitalist endeavour and corruption remain strong in the original film and are taken even further in the Jurassic World reboot. So where the park is littered with sponsorships. I don't know if you can see, but this building is sponsored by Samsung, and there's other images where you get spaces that are absolutely littered with different kind of corporate imagery, which also is both true for in-universe and for the product placements in the film itself. The reboot film is critical of this profiteering. It's quite a crucial plot point, which perhaps more closely aligns with the Frankenstein inspiration of Crichton's novel. So this results in scientists making the Indominus Rex, a hybrid of T-Rexes, raptors, and other deadly reptiles such as snakes, to create something that is bigger, scarier, and toothier than even nature made. This endeavour is all to generate an animal which is discussed as an attraction to what we discover is actually a failing, financially unviable park. But naturally, the obvious allusions to Frankenstein are in the problematic intervention of science and nature, or more specifically, human meddling in the natural order of things. In the original film, we're taken through this lab where a quite cute dinosaur hatches, actually, leading us to, at first at least, marvel before we feel terror at the implications of this scientific possibility. The film includes conversations where the ethics of this practice are pulled into question, which Jeff Goldblum famously articulates as, "Your scientists were so preoccupied with whether or not they could, they didn't stop to think if they should." Of this, Andrew Smith and William Hughes, in their introduction to eco-Gothic, discussed that for Victor Frankenstein, the disjunction between the utopian idealism of the project and its dystopian aftermath is intended as a critique. Frankenstein can be read as the dark shadow that critiques a Wordsworthian model of nature. That this model is also manifested in how the novel ends and indeed begins in the ecological dead zone of the polar ice cap. Nature fails to signify anything other than a type of blankness, which also demonstrates a crisis of representation. This is to say that Shelley's legacy in Spielberg's work is on the one hand about the folly of man overreaching itself, but I would argue that this runs a little deeper, that these films can represent that no matter what humans do, and not necessarily because of humans, nature will prevail in the end through its own indifference to human endeavour. Lisa Yazak points out that what is truly scary is not so much the destructive nature of the dinosaurs, after all, she says we rather expect that, but the fragility of our seemingly invincible human technologies. I would take this even further and suggest that it is the fragility of technology against the indifference of nature, which is the cause for most Gothic terror in these films. To expand on this, I want to briefly dip into some scholarship, which I think will really help our Gothic rereading of this film. So in particular, Jeffrey Jerome Cohen's Monster Culture 7 thesis, which, in his own words, offers a way of reading cultures through the monsters they engender, published just 3 years after Spielberg's Jurassic Park was released. His 7 theses for reading monsters include the fact that monsters speak to a particular cultural moment, which I think is fairly easily read in the original book and film. Dolly the sheep was born in Edinburgh in 1996, admittedly after the film by a few years, but nevertheless, I think that the fact that the DNA technology breakthrough allowed for this was well in the public consciousness around the 1990s and early 2000s, which, and then leaps in genetic technology again made gains in 2012 when Jennifer Doudna and Emmanuel Carpentier published their findings that they could edit DNA using CRISPR technology. Jurassic World was released only 3 years later in 2015, which makes the storyline of the Indominus Rex speak a little bit more explicitly to fears about genetic enhancements and splicing that were probably in the cultural consciousness or unconsciousness at the time. Moving on, the monster always escapes. See, for instance, Frankenstein's conclusion, which sees Victor giving chase over the Arctic ice, and Dracula's ability to, as a revenant, to kind of return time and time again. Of this, Cohen suggests that we can see the damage that the monster wreaks, the material remains, the footprint, the bones of the giant. But the monster itself turns immaterial and vanishes to reappear somewhere else, ready to stalk again in another bigger than ever sequel. Its threat is its propensity to shift. As you can see from the GIF I've got up here, I hope it's a little bit dark. The threat of the dinosaurs, or at least in the original film, was of course that they were big and toothy and fast, but there's a lot to be said for when they're not on screen. They could, in the first film, always appear more or less out of nowhere, and they sometimes announce themselves in ways that remain, to this day, I think, quite chilling. Nevertheless, escape is crucial to the franchise, partly because it is a franchise, and, as Cohen gestures to, requires the ability to make another sequel. Yet I'd complicate this ever so slightly. At the end of the original and the reboot, it is the humans who escape the reclaimed island, perhaps subtly refiguring who the monster may in fact be. And again, this kind of, to me, alludes to who's the real monster in Frankenstein. It's at this point I would gesture actually to the internalized colonialism in the book and the films. The park itself is not situated in the US mainland, on the one hand giving this a touristic edge. However, this also shunts the potential threat that this endeavor represents onto an unnamed island off the coast of Costa Rica. This recalls to my mind the historical colonial expansion of the US into Central and Southern America, as well as the neo-colonial use of Central America and the Caribbean as luxury tourist destinations. The effect of extractive colonialism and contemporary tourism on the environment and native populations remains disastrous to this day, and positions these sites as otherworldly, away from the everyday. They're somewhere that we in the West go to escape. This colonial sentiment allows the park to take place that is somewhere than other to where we, the Western audience, might live. Drawing on the imperial Gothic tradition, spaces such as Africa and Central America represent a wilderness to which one might be lost, physically and psychologically. You might be familiar with Joseph Conrad's Heart of Darkness in this kind of tradition. Furthermore, the aesthetic of the park itself recalls a very broad and homogenized version of the historical buildings of the indigenous peoples of Central and South America. Pictured here is one of the Tikal temples in Guatemala. Using angular architecture with gradual slopes and fire, the aesthetic, which is meant to represent a pre-human world, turns to the way that indigenous people's art and architecture is itself encoded as pre-civilization to uphold racist ideologies. In the newer films, this aesthetic is revisited, albeit with a more futuristic edge, asking pressing questions about the role of modernity and how exactly we might measure progress, technological and social, in spaces which are decolonizing or still experiencing economic colonialism. Therefore, to return to Cohen, when the monster escapes, again, perhaps for the purposes of a sequel, is it just the dinosaur we're talking about? Throughout history, European and North American forces, as we have now seen with the crisis in Afghanistan, colonial forces enter and then they leave, leaving chaos in their wake, but for whom the credits roll, only to reappear elsewhere again and again. Returning to Cohen, he goes on to note that the monster is the harbinger of category crisis. It dwells at the gates of different, polices the borders of the possible, and also represents a kind of desire. Cohen elaborates that one kind of difference becomes another in the monster, and the normative categories of gender, sexuality, national identity slide together like the imbricated circles of a Venn diagram, abjected from the center which becomes the monster. Yet a danger resides in this multiplication. The possibilities of escape, resistance, disruption arise with more force, he says. The dinosaurs in Jurassic Park represent primarily a scientific crossing of boundaries, as we've already kind of touched upon. But the monster is also a temporary egress from restraint. In other ways, most notably, the dinosaurs in Jurassic Park create a world where sexual categories are in flux, or rather human beings create a world in which it's possible for the categories of alive and dead, endangered, in danger, male and female, to be subject to change. The gift that I have here is often acknowledged as a moment of foreshadowing, where Alan, in the absence of a seatbelt which will keep him safe, notably needing one male and one female component in order to do this, hello heteronormativity, adapts to the conditions of using human problem-solving skills. Donna Haraway, in Staying with the Trouble, points out that in response to climate crisis, she sees a comic faith in techno-fixes, that somehow technology will come to the rescue of its naughty but very clever children. That's us, by the way. The scientific advancements in genetic technology create a utopian promise in real life and in these films. They're not meant to create havoc, and yet it's because they destabilize the need for binaries such as male and female, which also makes them monstrous in these films. So this brings me to thinking about the ways, about the dinosaurs as a way of destabilizing sexual binaries and codes. To do this, I want to draw on Donna Haraway's Cyborg Manifesto. Some of you may already be familiar with it, but if you aren't, it's a really excellent piece of feminist scholarship which discusses how the cyborg, a being who is a mixture of technology and biology, so not a robot, it's a different thing, offers some emancipatory and feminist possibilities, particularly in the ways that we think about the world and popular culture. The dinosaurs themselves sit at the intersection of science and nature, which, according to Haraway, could be a figure of emancipation. In the manifesto, she makes much of irony and playfulness as tools to think with as feminists. And I think there's much to be said about the fact that this franchise at least started as family-orientated films, which themselves sit at the intersection of seriousness and playfulness. You know, we go in and we learn some lessons and we have some fun along the way. Nevertheless, I want to examine the fact that these dinosaurs are cyborgs, perhaps not how we might traditionally imagine them, but nevertheless, I think they chime with what Haraway has to say, because these are figures ironically out of time. There is actually no time, which is their own, no place, which is partly what makes them so thrilling. They are, as we opened this session with today, entirely figures of contradiction. On the one hand, they are creatures of pre-human times, who, thanks to the naughty but clever children of technology, have been resurrected. They are situated alongside technology, on the other hand, because they are also figures of the promise of future technology. They are genetic splices heralding might be possible in humanity's own near future. So Yazak points out that the sciences of contemporary capitalism are marked by technologies of reproduction and simulation, which blur the boundaries between nature and technology, particularly, she writes, as they structure sexual identity. For instance, she says, the new reproductive technologies like in vitro fertilization, embryo transfer, and hormone manipulation challenge our conventional notions of reproduction as an organic procedure based on the natural and private union of two complementary male and female bodies. If reproduction, she says, can be defined as technological, then the normative status of heterosexuality and the complete heterosexual family demands reconsideration as well. I would argue that since the cyborg dinosaurs are destabilizing these kind of heterosexual roles, the entire Jurassic Park franchise is really preoccupied with establishing the heteronormative family as a social alignment, as a way to escape from these particular monsters. The first installment sees Alan, who we learn is fairly averse to having children, become caring and gentle towards Hammond's grandchildren, resulting in a group which replicates a gender-balanced family unit. Excuse me one moment. In the reboot, Jurassic World opens with a family who's going through divorce, hence sending two sons to their career-driven aunt who works at Jurassic World. By the end of the film, Claire, Bryce Dallas Howard, couples with Owen, played by Chris Pratt, who softens into a maternal role to save her nephews. Finally, in the most recent installment, Jurassic World Fallen Kingdom, the granddaughter of the proprietor of the park's research takes the place of the nephews to this time reunite Owen and Claire, who in the events between the two films have broken up. What is so fascinating about the latest released installment is that the little girl, Maisie Lockwood, is previously mentioned, acts as a catalyst for the heterosexual family unit made up of her, Claire and Owen. However, she herself is a cyborg, quite literally. She is a clone of her mother. She too is flesh and science compounded. The eerie promise of the very first film and the book has been realized in this character. She is real and then not quite real. In that way, all of the family units which ensure narrative survival are not real either. They're a facsimile of what we suppose a normal family looks like, just as the dinosaurs in the films look and behave like what we guess real dinosaurs look like. But they are canonically not purely only made up of dinosaur DNA, which is precisely what allows them to bend the rules of sex and reproduction in the first place. Just really briefly, this puts me in mind of a fan theory that I really like, which has floated around the internet for quite some time. You might be familiar with it, where basically it says that the dinosaurs aren't actually dinosaurs at all. They're actually, they're not a splice of dinosaurs and amphibians. They're actually total DNA composites, which simply look like dinosaurs, and Hammond is there to kind of fool them into thinking that they're real. Excuse me. And that they're not derived from dinosaur DNA at all. So even the way that fandom engages with these films acknowledges that the uncanny is actually at the core of what these films tell us about ourselves, our perception of the world, and the rules that govern that world. Indeed, no one in the films actually explicitly claims that these units are actually families. They look and operate as we assume families might. The Gothic, ultimately, is a conservative genre where order is restored by the end of a story. In these instances, like the seatbelt moment of foreshadowing, we are being asked to make the closest approximation to heteronormative life, and if we do, we'll be safe. Nevertheless, Haraway goes on to point out that the cyborg is resolutely committed to partiality, irony, intimacy, and perversity. It is oppositional, utopian, and completely without innocence. No longer structured by the polarity of public and private, the cyborg defines a technological polis based partly on revolution and social relations in the okios, the household. Nature and culture are reworked. The one can no longer be a resource for appropriation or incorporation by the other. Unlike the hopes of Frankenstein's monster, she says, the cyborg does not expect its father to save it through a restoration of the garden, that is, through the fabrication of a heterosexual mate, through its completion and a finished whole, a city and cosmos, she says. The main trouble with cyborgs, however, is that they are the illegitimate offspring of militarism and patriarchal capitalism. But illegitimate offspring, she says, are often exceedingly unfaithful to their origins. Their fathers, after all, are inessential. In other words, while the warnings of the franchise are for the human race not to overextend itself because the monsters that we make may not need us anymore, I find that there's a way of reading this as potentially liberating, which I'll get into shortly. Instead of being cyborgs wrought from steel, just like Shelley's creature in Frankenstein, they are wrought from flesh, sinews, and bones, the very stuff that, although not human flesh like in Frankenstein, asks questions about how the natural matter that we too are made of might be manipulated, or even threatening to natural order as explored in Fallen Kingdom, as I say, where Maisie is a clone of her mother. I would also pause to gesture to the fact that female dinosaurs become antagonists because they transform themselves into males. This is given a scientific explanation of frog DNA in the text and the film, but I think it's worth briefly revisiting under the frame that our trans and non-binary siblings are the subject of much hysteria, that they, through supposedly misplaced scientific intervention, can also go against the so-called natural order of things and change their sex, something which is mistakenly cited as a foundational scientific principle. However, I'd like to offer a positive queer reading of these dinosaurs. I think what makes them so compelling as villains in this franchise is they're not actually evil. They're just following natural instinct, and if anything, given their biological makeup, which includes that of amphibians who can change sex, they're following their natural path. In reading queerness into these dinosaurs, I suggest that they could be a tool to think through the ways in which the categories that science has constructed as totalizing in some parts of the public imagination, such as sex and gender, are insufficient to describe the reality of sex and gender that we actually see before us. This is only dangerous to us if we are trying to maintain an ontological foundation that was false in the first place. That is, if we are so limited that we cannot imagine another way of being. Yazak points out of Donna Haraway's Cyborgs that cyborgs are constructed rather than born. As such, they are freed from biology as destiny, which allows them the possibility of new identities and new ways of connecting with others. The possibility of mixture and change as new ways of being together is played with when Owen creates a kind of mixed species family unit. Much is made of his hierarchical position as the alpha among the raptors that he sympathetically trains. This sympathy is noted for its military value in the film. However, by the end of the film, Owen is depicted as running, figuratively, alongside the raptors, blurring the boundaries between human and animal, as previously noted, raising questions of how to be together. On the more uncharitable end of this, we also might read Blue's sacrifice towards the end of the film as a kind of noble savage trope where Owen has learned some lessons about family and feelings along the way, only to see the reformed monster, again encoded as part of an exotic landscape, sacrifice itself to save a white pseudo-family. Nevertheless, there's a lot of gender play in these films for humans too. However, this ultimately serves, I think, quite conservative ends. Laura Briggs and Jodie Kelber-Kay point out that Hannah's two grandchildren, Lexi and Tim, are improperly gendered in the novel, which I think in some ways is carried over to the film. So they detail how Lexi's sporty, tomboyish ways are eventually undercut by her fearfulness, which kind of realigns her with her femininity. Likewise, Tim's nerdy ways, including an interest in natural history, are what saves them in the novel, and he uses his knowledge of computing, which in the film is given over to Lexi, and it's generally acknowledged that the film is a little bit more liberal than the source material. Briggs and Kelber-Kay go on to note that in the novel, Crichton marks narrative problems to be solved through the improper gendering of women and girls who take up masculine, read professional roles, or who are tomboys dominating relationships with males. This is both contested and adhered to in the recent Jurassic World installments. As already noted, career woman Claire is masculine in the sense of being career driven, having little interest in her nephews and notably kind of palming them off to her PA. In the context of 2015, where the neoliberal girl boss sensibilities were driving some aspects of marketing towards women, it's hardly surprising that one of the ways in which her femininity is affirmed by the end of the film is her ability to heroically distract a T-Rex by running in heels. You'll probably recall the camera focus on the heels themselves, which I've got a GIF of down there. And there was a lot of kind of furore in the media about this as well. In the Hollywood Reporter, Dallas Howard herself defended the scene, noting this character needed to seem ill-equipped to be in the jungle. She was somebody who looks like she belongs in a corporate environment for a reason, because she was someone who was disconnected from the animals and disconnected from reality and disconnected from herself. She goes on to say she doesn't have to be in menswear and flats in order to outrun a T-Rex. That's what women do. I don't know about you, but I tend not to. Which on the one hand isn't actually all that objectionable, but in this iteration of the franchise, we still get the sense that this woman is not in her natural place by being out of turn with the nature that surrounds her, by being out of sync with things like the T-Rexes. So this brings us to the final of Jeffrey Jerome Cohen's monster theses, that the monster stands at the threshold of becoming. Cohen writes, monsters are our children. They can be pushed to the furthest margins of geography and discourse, hidden away at the edges of the world and the forbidden recesses of our mind, but they always return. And when they come back, they bring not just fuller knowledge of our place in history and the history of knowing our place. They ask us how we perceive the world and how they have misrepresented what we have attempted to place. They ask us why we have created them. I would argue that the re-emergence of the franchise in the late 2010s and early 2020s speaks to the pressing relationships that human beings have with nature. I've already discussed a little bit how the parks are always located in sites which will see the consequences of climate crisis brought about by Western capitalism the fastest. In Fallen Kingdom, a volcano, crucially a natural and not man-made natural disaster, threatens the island, which has become a kind of reserve for the dinosaurs. But the resonances with questions about climate crisis are very much there in the film. This screenshot is from the beginning of The Fallen Kingdom, and although not naming Trump explicitly, it's quite a clear reference to his rhetoric of climate denial in 2018 when the film was released. Elizabeth Parker discusses how the forest is pre-civilization. For Europe and the Americas, the wilderness was something that was carved through to, in the end, to build our villages and towns and cities, and thus engenders the Gothic imagination, she says. I would contend that a further dimension that we can add to this is the jungle. The jungle practically is, of course, forest, but the jungle represents these anxieties as they pertain to spaces far away from the West. The park itself, I would argue, can be read through the lens of the Gothic deep, dark forest. The forest, Elizabeth Parker points out, when we imagine the forest, we tend towards extremes. The landscape is commonly read as a binary space, as either good or bad. When it's good, it's the remedial setting of wonder and enchantment. When it is bad, it is dangerous and a terrifying wilderness. The park, likewise, is a space of both wonder and terror, as we can kind of imagine as what seeing this might be if we were really there, right? One of the things that separates it from the fantastical forest of the Gothic is that this space crucially represents the eventual extinction of humanity, very much sitting at the intersection of the leafy green natural spaces that we can see in the background and the glass and steel of modernity. Questions about conservation are born across the franchise, particularly, in the latest films. This image of the dinosaur encroaching on a zoo, an urban built environment, emerges from how the jungles of Costa Rica or some other exoticized island occupied by non-human inhabitants of the past speaks to our sense of deep time. Deep time tells us that we are only fleeting in our individual and in our species-wide existence on this planet. Jeff Goldblum uttered the words "life finds a way" in 1996, but hearing this back in 2021 after multiple natural disasters due to climate crisis across the globe, the possibility of our life finding a way seems less and less likely. As Roy Scranton points out in Learning to Die in the Anthropocene, we are effed. The only questions are how soon and how badly. He goes on to point out that life on Earth will continue without human beings. So he asks us, how do we die better? How do we reduce our impact on the Earth in the time that humanity has left? I think in a way, Jurassic Park asks that question too. In the contemporary reboot, Jurassic World shows how the new park has been built right alongside the one from the original film. Now, on the one hand, intertextuality always gives audiences a buzz, and nostalgia is partly why we watch these films at all. However, I think that this is a bit of a musing on how we are, at least for the time being, destined to make the same mistakes over and over again if we remain driven by capitalism. This image, I think, speaks to this repetition. The font and gate are recognizable to us, but the technology that we use to journey into the park, into the deep dark forest, has become faster, sleeker, and more efficient. The more recent franchises mostly respond to Hollywood's franchise model, as you might imagine, where intertextuality and nostalgia guarantee a paying audience. But nostalgia in this context is not for a time where human beings were not at the apex of the food chain, but perhaps reflects a cathartic fantasy that even against total destruction of our world, our family structures, our sense of bravery and our intelligence will somehow outwit even the scariest of ancient giants. In the contemporary moment, Jurassic Park is now edging beyond the promise of Jeffrey Jerome's Cohen theses that the monster always escapes. What happens when we have to live with the monsters? Relevant figures in Gothic literature, such as the zombie, the vampire, and cunning androids and ghosts, invite ways of being together in a horde, a nest, a coven, or an imprisoning home. We now broach the question of how we live with the monster of climate crisis, global inequalities, which COVID-19 has very much brought to the fore, and our relationship to our dying in a natural world. How can we as individuals, excuse me, and as a society be together with our monsters? They cannot be tamed, but is the answer even to overcome them? Who knows? Perhaps life will find a way. Just as a final thing to do together, I thought that we might watch the trailer for the upcoming installment, Jurassic World Dominion. Perhaps something to discuss together. To my mind, this trailer speaks to, seems to complete the arc both tonally and in plot towards the apocalyptic. All right, thank you for your attention. Please enjoy this short little clip. guys.